This is an audio recording meant to substitute a written note, so hopefully I've got enough of the pieces together now to make a coherent dissertation. So this is meant to be a notes on fully integrating the four sides of the mind model of MBTI. So the example that I use will be my own type, INTJ, since that's easiest for me. So I had a long discussion and conversation involving these matters in which I think some progress was made. So I'm going to try and try to condense that as well I can. So let me just get on with it. So I'm going to iterate some of these things as almost rules of how ordinary function works and how certain combinations of these features not working together result in particular forms of mental cognitive pathology. Okay, so the first topic, I guess, will just be in distinguishing the unconscious. So I'm mainly just going to focus with the ego and the unconscious, since I do think that at least the subconscious is a fully ancillary issue, which we'll sort of get into in the end. And although I think that the superego is distinctly different to the unconscious, and the ego in terms of its ontological relationship to how these sides of the mind form, at least with my general explanation of the ontology of those things, that would be able to quite easily be re-engineered from just understanding how the ego and the unconscious mind relate. So I'm just okay. So first of all, the unconscious is strange. I'm not going to deal with it comprehensively in terms of the ontology of its emergence in distinction to the ego. But one of those features which do need to be emphasized is that the unconscious is happens first in cognition. And after the ego is generated, the ego is capable of changing the unconscious in some way, but still the unconscious mind is always the first or the prior field of cognition, and the ego is always subsequent to the unconscious. Okay, so the weird thing about the unconscious mind is that its four functions, therefore, are essentially all devaluations. So they are all negative values, which are meant to correspond with the ego's positive affirmation of positive values. So there's a kind of inverse thing in which the ego only operates in the room left over for it by the sort of layers of sort of potential agitations and sensitivities constructed out of the functions in the unconscious mind, which are calibrated essentially by the ego, that sort of which have generally been able to sort of co-opt that entire side of the mind to basically be the imprint, the negative imprint of the ego's positive values. Um, so essentially, there's a translation between positive and negative. Now, this has therefore some functional ramifications, which would in otherwise be in a because in some sense you can just say, well, the leading function in these four functions, the parent function and the child function and the inferior function, using those terms and labels generically to apply to any side of the mind, um, those have a set kind of symmetry with each other and relationship to each other. And that breaks down ever so slightly in terms of the unconscious taking on this negative role, in that essentially the generally speaking, the parent function is tasking the hero function with a particular sort of motivation or direction, which is being sourced within the child function, within valuing the child function, in some sense, and that needs some elaboration as well. But when it does this, it is in effect it is giving the hero function a just read. Uh, um, the parent function is serving the hero function by framing direction forged from assigning value and motivation um, from the child function to bestow the fortune within the hero's quest. Without the extracted fortune via the parent-child flow towards its summary conclusion in the hero, an alternative flow uh, of fortune extraction is facilitated, which is essentially when the inferior function um, becomes a pseudo hero function, and then you sort of go in at least if you're in the ego, then you move into the subconscious. Um, Let me just elaborate. So the parent serves two other roles. The parent bestows value onto the child in order to secure the inferior into an arrested state of irrelevancy, in order to service the hero with a framed opening of some delineated ambit of operation. Perhaps then the parent is only catering to the hero, and to the child only as an indirect service of providing cover and security for the hero. And so, in some sense, the parent is merely placating the child. Now, anyway, that is focusing on that. Basically, in the unconscious mind, the parent function is called the critic, and the hero function is called the nemesis function. And the difference here is that because these are devaluations, because these functions are dealing in a material of devaluation, that means that because they're negative constraints, they're sort of they're demarcations of barbed wire and territory, or sort of sensitivities. These sensitivities really compound within the hero function. So usually the hero function is just merely framed, whereas in the unconscious mind, it's more of a composite medium in which the parent function, or the critic specifically, is interlaced within the field of the nemesis function, which is like a continual sort of um, security system that is projected onto the terrain and the environment and when there's enough free space within that terrain, then the ego has enough freedom to sort of um, articulate some interesting development, or so you really need a lot of nebulousness within the unconscious mind to create um, a sense of free play within the ego, uh, for it to do something interesting. Um, and the more structure there is in that terrain, in what is perceived as a kind of summarized obstacle course, as the nemesis is really the summary conclusion of all the apparatus within the unconscious mind. Um, Although obviously that is always threatened by the inferior function, which in the unconscious mind is called the demon function, because it really does threaten to unsettle the whole apple cart. Um, anyway, that needs me to go further into how the unconscious leads on into the ego. So let me just uh, go on about the nemesis. So the nemesis function is the summary of the unconscious mind. Um, so long as the demon function is not threatening to the sort of make the composite uh, project, or sort of although in this particular sense it's more like a kind of a reading of the terrain. It's more like a kind of you know that the danger is far enough displaced from the center of operating that the ego has enough sort of uh, laxity in terms of not being not having to sort of focus on the nemesis function or the work function. Um, anyway, the important thing really is that the nemesis function is being properly attuned with the summary of the ego, which is the hero function, obviously. And the hero function needs to make sure that it has a good duplication of its negative translation. It has to fit like hand and glove around the sort of the indent of its unconscious imprint, of the unconscious imprint of the hero function in the ego. And so any mismatch between these two things are well, I don't really want to describe pathology in such in this is a bit too obtuse. It's actually because the mismatch will actually be occurring because of essentially the parent functions involved, and so I'd rather focus on that. But it's interesting is because essentially when this mismatch occurs, in a sense, it's already too late, and the only thing that it does is it sort of uh, it gives credence and charge and emphasis to the inferior function, which essentially looms the appearance. It sort of invokes the looming appearance of the subconscious or the superego, depending on which uh, depending on which side, depending on if oh, I guess I should state why the one comes into play. I guess the I guess that there are two ways to get to the superego. You can get to the superego through the subconscious, or through the well, or through the subconscious, sorry, or through the unconscious. Although I would suspect that the only real way to get to it is through the unconscious. Anyway, yeah, I don't want to get into at least the subconscious too much, because I do think that it is a huge diversion um, from the actual integral functioning things. That I do think that in some sense the subconscious, not the superego, but specifically the subconscious, um, is is really a distraction, as a kind of escapism, um, where the ego is being escaped because of the fundamental asymmetrical sort of imbalance, uh, is being balanced out that way, essentially through enacting a kind of an incoherent alternative interpretation, which is fundamentally incommensurate with the ego. Uh, and so, one is really acting out uh, an ulterior ego in some sense, a kind of a competing ego, uh, in the sense that they inhabit mutually exclusive motivational structures, uh, which is, just you can just sort of, that's the inversion of the child and the parent, effectively. But okay, let me move on. What should the next topic be? Yeah, so there are these sort of disparate topics which are almost like so I almost want to sort of, I'm not going to prove some of these claims. They're just sort of by definition almost, but or no, this is somewhat core to some kind of theoretical supposition, although something similar might be true, and this might not be exactly true. But I would say that the reason why the ego generally enjoys what I would poetically describe as the seat of consciousness is because effectively the hero is dominating and lording over the parent and the inferior function. Obviously, it has to dominate the inferior function, at least, or indirectly via the parent. Otherwise, it's an in open, it's in the process of being openly contested, which would effectively be an unstable um, uh, process of cognition. It would be a something that would not be able to have a coherent or consistent pattern, and so it would, you know, essentially, people would be threatened with obvious non sequitur, disparate inconsistencies. So anyway, the hero must dominate and lord over the parent and the inferior. Um, I I'm going. Yeah, I've already made the claim that I believe that in some sense the parent is only serving the hero, although it is by necessity serving the child, and and it's strange. Well, in that it is, and it is. When I say by necessity, it doesn't really. It's not a good description, but basically, it's doing that in order to furnish the hero with motivation, as I kind of already described, with a sense of fortune, um, to frame and direct a sense of sort of that there is something to be done, there is some quest. Um, and that is only threatened essentially by an alternative flow of fortune in which the former child becomes the parent and the former parent becomes the child, and the new parent is extracting the fortune, the sense of fortune from its new child, and giving it to what was the inferior function. Now, a good summary overview of some of these mechanics is to summarize the what I would call the two eyes of the mind, the primary eyes. Now, what I'm about to say, with them being the two primary eyes, this is all up for revision, especially when integrating, because I'm not even going to touch it, but the superego, because the topic of the superego in conjunction with this is going to sort of dismantle all these descriptions, although these descriptions are meant just to understand the kind of the operating features. Okay, so the first one is, and this will also introduce my next topic, which is really understanding within each side of the mind, like how to see the four functions operating together. So the trickster function is really the first eye, and the thing that it is seeing is the inert substance that it is seeing is its inferior function, and so uh, so with just its inferior function, which is not inferior in at this point in any way, it is sort of the this just sort of pure observation. It's very inert. It's sort of, it's just, it's not being filtered in any way. It's just this kind of broad spectrum thing, which the child function has a kind of unadulterated access to. Then what happens, because I'm talking about the unconscious mind, the parent function is essentially trying to extract a sense of motivation in a devalued commodity. It doesn't quite translate that well, and this is why the trickster function doesn't really, like, when the unconscious becomes the unconscious, and each function is set to devaluing, or devaluation. uh, the generic roles that these functions should be playing for one another, or toward one another, just sort of, they take on a different characteristic. And so the parent function, which is called the critic function in the unconscious, is treating the trickster, well, as a very heightened sense of sensitivity, and it really has to be properly, these sensitivities have to be sort of sacrosanct in some sense, but they are also only delineated in terms of negative stipulation. So that's a very hard translation to make, is to sort of define all the quests that would be invalid in terms of their motivational direction. So it's a hard thing to extract, and then the parent function has to interpret that extraction and delineate a kind of a minefield, or a sort of a field of potential mines of that it has to project onto the terrain, or that it sort of has to have some accounting of it within itself, and then it has to offer that as a framework to the nemesis function, so that the nemesis function can sort of be a medium of sort of encapsulating all the layers of of summarizing all the so it has to create a negative quest for itself. It has to sort of in some sense, I mean, it might be worth it for me to describe the nemesis function, although they were generally it's been described always well to me, and I've always just sort of repeated the same sort of lines, which is that it's you might as well just get through it. You might as well just sort of confront the challenges and do it properly, and just sort of like incorporate the burden that it represents. And take responsibility for it. And I was going to say that if you are aware of the trickster function in particular, if your focus is on sort of channeling that particular element, this is going a bit too ahead, but I think I should say it now, even though it's kind of extraneous to what I'm talking about, is that obviously you are generally always going to be aware of the parent function in the ego, which is the other I. So the trickster function is the one I, and then the parent function, the ego, is the other I, which is slightly asymmetrical because the one is a parent function, the other one is a child function. But the FE really, in terms of an INTJ, the FE trickster function is the first, is the purest intake, or it is like the first input of engaging with anything, although it's obviously in a negative form. And so it's the most raw and unprocessed input that the mind gets. And so it will immediately filter reality in its most basic, in your most basic mental capability, is going to be filtered by the trickster. Now, what generally ends up happening in a thematic summary way is that obviously that trickster gets obviously then processed by your critic function and summarized into your nemesis function. Those are also true, but I just want to emphasize that the most raw opportunity of broadest insight and sort of mental responsibility that is possible within the architecture of the four sides of the mind is represented by the trickster function. Okay, so that is the first I. Then the second I is the parent function in the ego. Now, this is somewhat an interpretation, and I'm not doing this because this is like, it's as meaningful as the substantiation that I'm putting to lining it up this way. So there are other interpretations that could be made that might be more insightful, but this is the one that I'm making. So the reason why I'm pairing it with TE is because, or the trickster function with the parent function in the ego, which for an INTJ is TE, is because this I see as the fundamental source of fuzzy vision, or sort of incompatible problematic thinking, or dysfunctional desyncing. The desync that occurs is between these two elements. And so generally what you will find happening is that FE will be taking on the bias represented in the parent function in the ego. And whatever synthesis is being concocted by the parent function in the ego, which has a lot of power in itself, because the parent function really has to do a lot, especially in the ego. It's double binded, and it's weighted, because it has to essentially fulfill the space represented by the trickster function. The trickster function is a devaluation, so it is a very particular void. It's a very particular opening for something else to take its place, and that something else to take its place must correspond with the space available. And so there are two types of mismatches that can occur, and the mismatch will so just I can then sort of just get into what the parent function has to do. Let me think if I went over the inferior function and the child function. So the child is really the only independent force, I would say, within any side of the mind. The child function is a kind of standalone thing. And, it really is a kind of independent force because it is capable of redirecting its role. If it's not being respected as a child, it ends up being facilitated to sort of become a parent, and just sort of reverse the flow of fortune. instead of having its fortune extracted from it, if that extraction is not done so with a certain amount of fidelity in order to sort of keep the child in some kind of commensurate balance with its inferior function, which it is sort of, which is ordinarily it's forced to sort of confine. It's supposed to sort of allow its toy, using the analogy that the inferior function is like the toy of the child. It should allow its toy to be displaced and dislocated in some manner or fashion that's not too erratic. But if the toy is maimed beyond recognition, that is threatening to the child, because then the child is so dispirited or sort of disorientated and uprooted that it no longer has a fortune that can be extracted from it by the parent. So the parent has not tended to it with a correct amount of fidelity to the child's internal composition in some sense. And that generally will result in the child becoming a parent and serving its new hero, the old inferior function. So the maimed toy becomes a hero. It's this perhaps even has a correspondence to the general archetype of the underdog, sort of reversing its role. I just wanted to say that it is therefore, if the parent I is sort of doing things in an uncorresponded way with the trickster I, within a lopsided way, in a way that's too biased, then it is as if the other eye is closed, and only one eye is open. And according to that other eye, the reverse is also true, perhaps, so that you get a sort of an internal fracture. Oh, so there's more than one division. There's a division on the positive side, and there's also a division on the negative side. And so you can sort of get, I believe, some kind of there's probably a better English word that I'm not thinking of, but perhaps something like autism, in terms of the unconscious mind. But then also what happens is that I'm just basically saying that if the trickster eye is open, it will always correspond to the parent. So if the trickster eye has vision on something, if its eye is open, you know that the other eye is also meeting, maybe not converging in a perfect sort of alignment, but both eyes are cast upon the immediate terrain in some sense. Anyway, the point of pointing this out is just that I think it's important to emphasize that that the one eye, the unconscious eye, implies both eyes, whereas the converse is not true. That just talking about the parent eye is not enough. And I think that this is and this is effectively because um, if the parent is just being considered in isolation, and it can very easily be considered in isolation to the trickster eye, whereas the converse is not true. Uh, that the subconscious is coming into play. Anyway, that's not that profound, but here, let me see what other elements to point out. Okay, yeah. So there was this whole tract that I wanted to get into, which is how the parent function in the ego has really a lot to contend with simultaneously, because it has to uh, facilitate the extraction of a value and motivation in the child, or from the child rather, so that it can task the hero, or no, frame the hero's field of operating in a, to sort of cordon off the sort of the direction of the quest, in some sense, um, sort of to make sense of what progress would be for the hero. Um, and the parent has to do that also with a view, and this is a bit higher grade perhaps, but also with a view to allowing the hero to leave an imprint of itself in the unconscious mind, uh, that is consistent with the hero's actions and behavior. And that that is very tricky for the parent to sort of, I mean, because it's not necessarily, that's not built into its immediate function, but that essentially is one of its, because if it's not capable of facilitating that, and it is really sort of on its head, and so the parent actually gets into a kind of meta bind, because that isn't obvious at the outset, but that eventually that will reveal itself as the kind of as a constraint and an ongoing condition, and a kind of a performance uh, requirement of its role. And as soon as it's sensitive to having to sort of play this, to have to monitor this feedback indirectly, it starts to also develop a kind of an exhaustion, I would say, because it starts to gain an appreciation of its, well, of being double binded. Um, let me just functionally go through all the exactly how those how that double binding occurs. So the parent function itself has to leave an imprint of itself in the unconscious mind, in the form of the critic. So it has to sustain a a critic that is facilitating uh, the nemesis, and if its critic is not facilitating a commensurate enough nemesis that assists the ego's hero, or makes room for the ego's hero, then the parent function indirectly has failed. The parent function has to extract a sense of fortune from its child function, in order to secure the hero against the inferior function. So it has to value the child function. It has to find the value in the child function, to transmit that to the general framework that the hero can operate within. Sort of safely within. Which is not really, according to the parent, it's not a positive role. The child function, it's more, it's dealing with the child function as an indirect necessity of having to contend with the inferior function. The hero function can sort of take the optimistic view on that. Now, this is why the parent function generally needs to have its second eye from the trickster, which is its source of optimism. So the parent function wants to correspond, wants to have a joint view with the trickster function, so that it can sort of invigorate itself. And the trickster function is primed to do this because it is in an optimistic role, being a child function itself. It's sort of it has that spirit of independence, which only sort of child functions and hero functions, in some sense, they can't be called independent, but they like to think that they've inherited that independence from their immediate child functions via the parent. So because of the parent, they are codependently powerful. In some sense, they are fortified. But anyway, but yeah, the only real source of independence is the child function, of pure independence. So the parent function, in some sense, is sort of tarnished by its own facility uh, or facilitation of its child function for its hero function. And actually, when it believes that it's actually in extracting its own source of fortune at the same time as providing it to the hero function, it's not actually doing so. It's covertly doing this in the guise of the trickster. And so, in some sense, what the parent function is doing is it's confusing the trickster with the with its child function. It's treating them as interchangeable. Well, it's more convoluted, or it's more complicated than that, because well, it's not that it's substituting the its child function for the trickster function. It's more like in its involvement with the child function, it sees its form of facilitation as being equivalent to the trickster function. So in substance, so that essentially it is it's the substance of the parent function is interchangeable with the substance of the trickster function. And that is not necessarily false as well. That is actually the truth, because the unconscious is a negative imprint of devalued contentions and sensitivities. And so that's actually like that can sort of line up. Well, it can line up within a very particular metaphysical paradigm in which the knowledge of good is the inverse of the knowledge of evil. You know, it's a sort of simple binary thinking. So within the dominion of binary reality, that functions. Uh, I'm just trying to think. So again, the other thing that's worth pointing out is that whenever we are dealing with things, we are first dealing with anything via the unconscious first, which is a sort of a bundle of sensitivity uh, and sort of a bank of potential agitation. And individually, each eye of the mind, the trickster with its corresponding critic function, and then it's sort of its summarized idea of in the nemesis. Those each have their um, separate lines of connectivity with the functioning in the ego. And so let me see if I can speculatively extend some of this stuff. So I think that the nemesis function is, well, you can't even say that it is dominating and lording over its inferior function and its parent function, because it's these things again, like they are negative imprints of value. So because they know what they devalue, they don't know what they value, they end up sort of, they can be consistent with each other, and they can sort of compound into a lattice of sort of, it seems that the unconscious mind would naturally be easier to bring into coherence. I guess the only problem would be is that if there is no room for the ego to operate, because the unconscious is permanently contending with infringements or infractions defined by its devaluation, so that it's sort of purely signaling agitation. You want the nemesis function to be as to have as small a footprint as possible. And the thing that represents its largest footprint is its raw source material, which is the trickster function. So the immediacy to which that can be I thought of a good poetic word for a second, but that can sort of be compacted down into a self-contradictory set of points in which it can sort of be a malleable sort of I mean, you have to gain a full and proper mastery of it in order to for you to be able to sort of in a balanced way, balanced within its own sort of substance, be able to sort of overturn at will and sort of confound itself from within itself, leading captivity captive, sort of having a transcendent wisdom over it, would be sort of the first portal to freedom. And then that, however, does not um, completely save you, as you still have to effectively contend with the with how to enlighten the other I, the parent and the ego, because that whole side of the mind is begins primarily with the independent force of the child function, uh, which is being fed um, or based on the inert observation as collected by the inferior function, which is basically a retake of the demon function, as the inferior function is connected to the demon function, and that can't be, that's not subverted by merely being able to you know by being able to contend with the trickster is not the same thing as being able to contend with the demon function in the form of the inferior function in the ego. And to deal with the inferior function in the ego, it might also be necessary to reopen the issue and have to contend with the demon function in a completely new procedure of therapy or therapeutic process. Yeah, so I was just basically describing how, in some sense, there's only one real hero, which is obviously in the ego, and the nemesis function um, does not really dominate and lord over, because in some sense, uh, the parent function, or sorry, the critic function in the unconscious is actually, it doesn't just sort of point its hero, the nemesis, into a particular framed field of open operation. It sort of, it intermingles and sort of lays down a lattice within the substance of the nemesis, that it just, the nemesis is still a summary of the unconscious mind, but it is a compound. It doesn't sort of have these because the substance of it is a are not positive objects. Uh, they are negative conditions. Um, that really sort of are like the weight of adjective descriptions layered upon motion itself. The verb, the the thing that is happening, the significance of sort of the bank of interconnected, associated adjective im, uh, impact in one's yes, I mean this is a kind of reactive memory. Yeah, so one is capable of well, I'd say being able to sort of contend with the independent element within that reactive memory, so that it's not an automatic induction to sort of to what amounts to a kind of conducting one's affairs unconsciously, or having one's affairs and arrangements and sort of facilitated unconsciously. But the parent function, which is still trying to be codependent with the trickster function. So that's problematic, I guess, is that when you get the trickster function into a malleable form, it is empowering the parent function in the ego. Yeah, I do think there's probably is more that I could find to say, but I need to bring into view the superego before I can really continue on that particular thread. Yeah, I don't know if it's worth adding that I guess this is still a small enigma to me, but I can speculate that when the inferior function in the ego, how is it? So I mean, I've already said that it's tethered firstly to whatever things it has calibrated within. Actually, I mean, yeah, I guess I'll actually probably start talking about the, although I haven't given it much thought until right this very moment. The superego, I would say, is what I was going to say is that the inferior function, um, I've gone blank. Oh, yeah, well, the inferior function is obviously connected to its corresponding function. Uh, Specifically, the inferior function in the ego is connected to the demon function. Um, whereas the demon function, you can't really say like what is it connected to. Um, it's just connected to itself in some sense, and then obviously its architecture of where it might have some kind of metaphysical account of itself in terms of other functions is only found within the superego. But I do think that the superego is, technically speaking, outside of the false ego complex. It's not. It's not like the other sides of the mind, which are correlated or in a particular complex with each other. The superego is outside of the other three sides. To repeat myself. Uh, yeah, I don't want to say anything too much about the superego when I haven't thought about it. But I mean, the problem of translating it is that you can only really describe it through a fiction. It doesn't, because it is fundamentally a lie. It is not real. Um, and there's no telling how it's been interpreted. Is somewhat it's a kind of I think the best way to describe it would be a kind of invigilator. It's a sort of it's a the mind has given rise to emulating a kind of invigilator that has asked one questions and interrogated one so as to facilitate the establishment of the unconscious mind, which only exists from that prime exchange of that interaction. So it is in response to that invigilator, which is really, how do you describe it? But a sort of an incarnation of doubt and a sort of and a false ascertainment of existential certainty, and so it's somewhat establishing some sort of prime and carnal stricture in one's subjugation to an objective and exterior source of authority. And the source of this invigilator, it's not an external spirit. All spirits are within. It's a line of questioning. It's a persona. It's an attitude. It's just a component of the spirit of man. It's just one of the many hypothetical possibilities, imagined potentials. It is just a particular wavelength of thinking about the future, of representing a view of what the future contains and what the future should contain is its first fruit, is its first product, which is the knowledge of good and evil, which is the enslavement of the life force into tasting only the dust, crawling after the image of the future, the expectation, the lust of furnishing oneself with the imagined object, which is primarily identity. Identity which will only ever, this is just a sort of metaphysical, semantical sort of dissertation, but identity is always derived in or by collection, from themselves. That effectively is the camouflage that the exterior source of subjugation comes, that the spirit is made into a beast, the freedom is made into the conditioning. By the mind forged manacle, that this was the anyway. That whole tangent was not so helpful in specifically delineating. So how does the inferior function in the unconscious mind? Okay, well, I guess that gives some kind of somewhat mystical explanation as to how it might get itself off the ground. And so it's interesting because then at some point, I guess, when you dissolve that demon function, you almost have the choice to enter the valence of the superego, to somewhat reverse the role or play the other side of the particular tree of sort of to merely have an inverted tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to just sort of make the knowledge of evil good and the knowledge of good evil. That's essentially which I think, it might happen if someone doesn't approach that particular stage of self-development with the right attitude. But well, this is probably too speculative at this point. I don't think I'm going to say anything more original.